For the next quarter hour, the gallery resumed its practiced composure, as a pond will settle after a stone has slipped beneath. Hartwell returned with a step-ladder and a felt cloth draped over his arm. No one in that room would have guessed that he had, in his younger years, studied the mechanism of old frames as attentively as any restorer. But his hands, nearly as eloquent as a surgeon's, tightened the hook, tested the cord, and smoothed the gilt with a reverent thumb. When he stepped down, he paused, not from uncertainty, but to regard the narrow indent upon the velvet wall, an oval shadow paler by a fraction, as though another frame had briefly rested there some time ago and been removed again. He folded the observation into that private ledger wherein good servants keep the house's small mysteries, and moved on without comment. Basil Kettering, catching the final motion at the central painting, drew a breath that belonged to relief more than admiration. His smile, when he turned to Lady Vale, exhibited both his teeth and his caution. If we might, Lady Imogen, a few words to thank our patrons and perhaps to forestall inquiries of the more administrative kind. By all means, Basil. Lady Imogen's hand, light upon his sleeve, steadied a touch of nervous energy. Only keep them short. People do not come to hear speeches when there is champagne. He took his position with the grace of a man accustomed to lending dignity to insurance premiums and provenance reports. "We are indebted," he began, with the careful sonority of an announcer, "to those who have allowed us to borrow their memories. The velvet shadow," his hand indicated the central picture, "anchors the collection in more ways than one. Its subject, unnamed and some might say unknowable, reminds us that society is, at best, an arrangement of surfaces through which we glimpse essentials." The little group performed the ritual, a small scattering of applause, glasses raised, heads tilted as if toward a present ghost. In the softening murmur that followed, Helena Carstairs drifted to Felix Davenant's side, her voice pitched for him alone. "You deliver speeches handsomely, Basil," she remarked, without looking at him, "even when you are not the one speaking." Felix smiled. "It is a discipline one learns, to appear to be addressing the world when one is only talking to 2 or 3 people, and oneself. Or to one picture," Helena said, still studying the central canvas. "Do you suppose she was intended to be anyone at all? She looks like every woman who has ever waited to be told a secret." "She looks," Felix said after a moment, "like someone who already knows it." Dr. Evan Lyon, making a circuit at the edge of the crowd, came upon Camilla Arkwright, bent over her small notebook. The girl had sketched, with a spare economy of line, the handling of the sitter's right hand. The long, fluent fingers, the ringless third finger where one might have expected a token of some alliance. Dr. Lyon's eye sharpened a degree. "An omission?" she asked mildly. "A choice," Camilla answered, looking up quickly. "The painter has emphasized the hand, not its adornment. It's the point of the composition. Everything flows from the wrist to the knuckles, as if one were watching a thought travel." "Good," Dr. Lyon said. "Let no one persuade you out of looking for intention rather than accident." Across the room, Sir Marcus Blackwood lingered with Basil Kettering and Miss Meacham, whose brown dress and careful composure made her resemble some sober note at the bottom of a flamboyant canvas. Sir Marcus held a thin folder as one might hold a letter that had arrived too late. "I don't question your zeal, Kettering," he said in a low tone that nevertheless carried the quality of an accustomed public voice. "Only the speed with which certain items have altered hands in recent months. It gives the impression, perhaps unfounded, that the past is being improved for our convenience." Miss Meacham's pencil hovered. "The Armand authentication is sound, Sir Marcus. The signature you mentioned is from a period when the artist was experimenting with a broader nib. And his truths?" Sir Marcus smiled without warmth. "Were they broadening too?" Lady Imogen, floating near, caught the tail of the exchange and applied, as one would to a Nikon glass, the balm of civility. Marcus, you will terrify my poor Basil into a fainting fit. Allow him his perfections. They keep us from despairing of our own." The colonel, who had for some time maintained a position of amiable watchfulness by the French windows, discovered a small draught insinuating itself along the skirting. He turned and found the casement very slightly ajar, admitted, perhaps, by a guest with a taste for autumn air. He closed it with the tact of a man accustomed to sending the enemy politely from the room. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone. Fog coming in already. Helena, overhearing, glanced at the glass. The reflection returned the room to her, the lit faces, the raven pools of the polished floor, the steady glow on gilt. For an instant, the central portrait seemed to deepen, no more than the trick of a lamplight shift. Yet in that moment, the figure at its heart advanced, then receded, like a thought one cannot quite seize. Hartwell, on his way past with a replenished tray, observed Miss Meacham carefully locking the small office door, the fat ledger under her arm. He observed also that Lady Imogen, having played her hostess's part to perfection, had retreated one pace into stillness by the sergeant, the half-smile gone from her mouth, as if dismissed rather than surrendered. "Another glass, my lady?" "No, thank you, Hartwell." Her voice had the timbre of a woman listening for something behind the conventional noise of things. "Very good, my lady." The hour tilted. People began to calculate exits and obligations. Basil whispered of moving the most valuable pieces to the strong room once we have the place to ourselves. Dr. Lyon asked, without urgency, to see the back of a small landscape for a moment only. Sir Marcus stood a little apart, reading a note that had come to him in the undomestic hand of a messenger, his brows set in that peculiar effort men make when the past arrives in present grammar. Felix and Helena collected their wraps as though anticipating a final scene. Camilla hesitated, aware of the precise moment when one could leave without rudeness and remain without purpose. The lamps hummed. Somewhere in the house, a clock, decorous and decisive, prepared itself to strike. Inspector Roderick Alleyn stood for a quiet moment just inside the Grosvenor Gallery, as if allowing his eyes to adjust not only to the autumn light, but to the social temperature of the room. He was not a tall man by the standards of his profession, but composure lent him height, and his civility, like a well-cut coat, seemed made for rooms such as this. Rooms that preferred careful manners to blunt intrusion. Chief Inspector Fox, solid and unhurried, stationed himself near the entrance with a word to the constable. The gallery swallowed the small exchange in its velvet hush. Toward the center of the main room, under the velvet shadow, Lady Imogen Vale had been made as tidy in death as she had been in life. Dr. Curtis, who could appraise mortality with the discretion of a club physician describing a sprain, glanced up as Alleyn joined him, then returned to his unobtrusive notes. Alleyn looked first at surroundings, as was his way. Lamps placed to flatter oil and gilt, burgundy silk walls that favored conversation in undertones, the faintest scent of beeswax, lavender, and old varnish, the olfactory signature of money and good taste. A folding chair stood where a servant might have briefly set it, abolished in haste. He noted it and let the thought pass without comment. Only then did he look directly upon Lady Vale. The black velvet, the composed hands, the diamond turned inward against her palm, as if she had not meant to dazzle the dead. A silver letter-opener rose in neat relief between the shoulder blades, its handle engraved with interlaced initials, curving lines that might have resolved to an I and V or something more baroque. The silk behind her bore that single, dark mark, no vulgar spilling. Whoever had done this had employed restraint and possibly knowledge. Dr. Curtis murmured, barely moving his lips. No theatricals. Penetration of the heart, little hemorrhage, roughly midnight to 2, subject to the usual reservations. Alleyn made a fractional movement of his head that might have been thanks. He crouched that he might take the room from the level of the carpet. Scattered pearls glinted like a small constellation fallen to earth. He tested a thread remnant with the tip of a gloved finger. Not frayed, not exactly clipped either. A tension had broken something already weakened, or something had been encouraged to yield. One pearl had rolled to the slender shadow of the chair. One had come to rest, improbably, upon the hem of the dress as if reluctant to depart her orbit. It had not fallen far. He rose and moved to the painting above her. The velvet shadow presented a late Edwardian woman seated in profile, velvet absorbing the surrounding light until the figure seemed to gather darkness to herself. The sitter wore pearls. Alleyn's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, an inward acknowledgement rather than a comment. The hanging cord and the brass hook were new to him, but the faintest abrasion on the plate suggested someone had steadied the frame within the last 12 hours. He remembered the brief disturbance reported from the previous evening. A restless picture or a careful hand testing its composure. Miss Meacham waited by a small writing table upon which lay a leather folder and the gallery's guest book. She was very still. Alleyn approached as though to inspect an arrangement of flowers. "You found her," he said, and his tone made the statement both question and condolence. "Yes, Inspector." Her voice was a thread made strong by habit. "At 8:20. Everything was in order, except—" She did not glance at the body. "Except, of course." "Quite," said Alleyn. He did not press her. He studied the guest book, elegant signatures, modish and legible from last night's private view. Helena Carstairs had signed with an actress's flourish, Felix Davenant with a smaller hand that hid its vanity. Sir Marcus Blackwood's name appeared without ostentation. The ink beneath it was faintly blotted, as if the pen had hesitated. Camilla Arkwright had written with the careful upright of the recently trained. A faint smudge marred the margin at Basil Kettering's note of thanks, to guests as a class rather than as individuals. A hurried addition had been squeezed in near the lower edge, illegible, as if someone had not wished to be wholly absent, and yet not exactly present. Alleyn opened the leather folder with the unpersonal curiosity he might have bent upon a club menu. Authentication papers lay there, one bearing a signature whose loops and crossings, at first glance, imitated a known hand too perfectly. He allowed the page to close of its own weight. "Basil Kettering?" he asked. "In his office," Miss Meacham said. "He has telephoned the insurers." She added, almost apologetically, "He is very conscientious." "Undoubtedly." Fox had drifted nearer. "Entrances secured, sir. Back doors locked within. Windows latched on the inside. One in the east room shows a recent wipe on the sill, but no disturbance to the dust on the outer ledge." "Thank you, Fox." Alleyn turned to Lady Vales. "Handbag." The clasp yielded. Inside, in order, a small silver compact, a folded card of the private view, a handkerchief faintly scented, a pencil trimmed to diligence, and a key ring with a miniature ivory tablet engraved with dates. Committee meetings. Lectures. No loose coins. The expected economy of a woman who had never needed to carry cash herself. He closed the bag and looked for a moment through the tall window at the pale October light. In it, the room seemed to retreat to essentials. A chair, a painting, a woman who had conducted her life within such frames as society provided and who had now been removed from it by a hand as courteous as it was final. "Let us have the principal persons remain," he said quietly. "No more than comfort allows. Mrs. Vale's butler, if he is at hand. Mr. Kettering, Miss Meacham, and those guests from last night who are in easy reach." He paused, listening to the room as one listens to a stage before the curtain rises. "We shall be very civil to them, Fox. It is a civilized affair to all appearances." He bent once more to the pearls, counting without seeming to count, then straightened. The gallery's velvet walls held their secrets with composure. Alleyn, who trusted silence to yield more than noise, let it stand between them a moment longer before he began to ask. as gently as one might ask after a friend's health the first indispensable questions. The interviews were conducted in Lady Vale's small withdrawing room at the rear of the gallery, a place of pale paneling and a faint smell of beeswax, where conversation had always been expected to behave itself. Alleyn chose it deliberately. The room's discreet proportions and its out-of-the-way door suggested confidences that might never be uttered in the cavern of the main gallery. Fox established a quiet traffic through the corridor. Constables murmured like librarians. Basil Kettering presented himself first. Summoned from his flat nearby, he said, though Alleyn suspected he had been waiting within earshot of events since dawn. Kettering's thin hands were tightly laced over his knee, his mouth decisive, his eyes careful. "Lady Vale," he said carefully, "had the gift of making trouble appear serviceable. It is one of the many gifts we must now learn to do without. You have a staff list and a key schedule?" Alleyn inquired, almost as if he were discussing a wine list. "Who locked up last night?" "Lady Imogen herself," Kettering replied. It was her practice. Mr. Hartwell, James, saw the last of the guests to their cars. I accounted for the authentication papers. Miss Meacham checked the alarm. "The silver letter opener." Kettering looked startled, then controlled it. "Not gallery property, Inspector. I keep a simple steel one at my desk. That, object is of better quality. The monogram, I didn't observe it sufficiently to opine." "You observed a great deal of other things. Sufficiently," Alleyn said mildly. Kettering's lips parted and closed again with a little bird-like motion. "Dr. Lyon was troubled by a signature. That is the nearest thing to a disturbance we suffered. Our insurance, quite robust, I assure you, requires scrupulous documentation. It is my first duty, after piety to the deceased, to protect the gallery's integrity." "Quite," said Alleyn, and allowed him to go. Dr. Van Lyon followed, trim as a penknife. Her pince-nez caught the pale light, turning her eyes into twin points of inquiry. "I don't choose scandal," she said before he asked. "I choose accuracy. The Armand dossier contained a letter and a dated receipt whose script is too fluent for his later hand. Either an earlier slip found its way into later documentation, or someone has been, shall we say, over-helpful. Lady Vale's intention? To withdraw the picture if the question persisted. She was not sentimental about such matters. The painting is very good, Inspector. Perhaps too good for a forgery. But I have learned that excellence seldom absolves dishonesty." "Whom did she tell?" "Mr. Kettering, naturally. And Sir Marcus, I think. He is a trustee and, if I may be indelicate, sometimes our bridge between probity and purse." Alleyn inclined his head. "Thank you, Doctor." Sir Marcus Blackwood entered, wearing mourning already, though his tie was merely darker than custom demanded. His distinction carried an undertow. One sensed the effort behind the poise. "An appalling business," he said, with a gravity that veered away from pathos. "Imogen was, one uses the word too often, formidable." "Your connection to the gallery, Sir Marcus?" Alleyn asked. "The Blackwood Trust holds a quiet interest. Lady Imogen and I were old friends. Our families have met in committees and country houses since before I learned my Latin." He gave a small, dry smile. "You'll have queries about the object that killed her. The monogram, so I'm told, resembles my initials. Many things do. Our house silver bears them, as do 1,000 others. You left the gallery last night at a few minutes past 11. I had a word with Imogen near that central portrait. We disagree occasionally about what should be seen and what should be kept as an anecdote," he said, letting the word float. "We were not quarrelling. I do not quarrel with women I respect." Helena Carstairs made the room seem fractionally larger, as actresses sometimes do by merely selecting their chair. She placed her gloves side by side as if setting props. "I remember the silk cord," she said. "It shifted and everyone pretended it hadn't. It is extraordinary, Inspector, how easily we accommodate tremors. I left at 11:30, I believe. I saw Sir Marcus and Lady Vale, yes. One could have cut that conversation and served it cold. You noticed anyone near the office? The writing desk? Alleyn asked. A shadow, perhaps. Miss Meacham or Mr. Kettering or the ghost in the title. One tires of naming shadows, don't you find? Her smile was slow. Felix Davenant was being very attentive to a girl. Pretty serious. I assumed it was the usual theatre of admiration. Lady Imogen did not care for theatre unless she curated it. Felix Davenant came in with a contralto apology for lateness and the unstudied grace of a man trained to speak to darkness. I left at 11:30, he said. Camilla, Miss Arkwright, and I looked rather too long at the Whistler. It is a professional disease. I passed Lady Vale and Sir Marcus in what I took to be a confidential exchange. If there was heat, it did not spill. You know the letter opener? Alleyn asked. I know stage daggers, he said, faintly amused. I cannot claim intimacy with writing implements. The monogram suggests a person. The thing itself suggests control. Camilla Arkwright was pale with the exhaustion of a night spent rehearsing every gesture in memory. She held her hands as if aware they could betray her. Lady Vale turned her ring inwards when she was displeased, she said, surprising herself. I saw it last night when she looked at the Armand. It is silly to notice, but I notice such things. And her pearls, she usually wore sapphires for evening, I think. The pearls felt new. They were broken, Alleyn said gently. Yes, Camilla whispered, but they fell as if asked to. When they were gone, Alleyn stood at the withdrawing room window and watched the pale day hover over the mews. He had, he thought, been offered any number of correct statements, shaded with discretion. The gallery beyond them lay in its velvet hush. Just outside the door, James Hartwell stood very straight and very still, the distilled essence of service. Alleyn noted the fractional pause when his name was spoken, the kind of slight resistance one feels in a well-oiled drawer that has been opened a shade too often. He would, he decided, speak with Hartwell next, but quietly, as one asks the time in a church. The service corridor ran behind the velvet walls like a vein, narrow, practical, unapologetically plain. Alleyn preferred it. Rooms that declared their dignity often lied. Rooms that stored mops and lamp oil, rarely. He asked for the household staff to come one by one, and they arrived with a particular reserve of those who understood that their knowledge was valuable chiefly because it was never displayed. James Hartwell, Lady Vale's butler, entered first. He carried his dignity as some men carry a uniform, unquestioned and unremarked until challenged. His gaze rested a moment on the silver-framed photograph upon the mantel. Lady Imogen and a younger woman in an old garden, the past looking quietly back at the present. You were here last evening, Mr. Hartwell, Alleyn began, his voice acknowledging without insisting. Until 11:15, sir, Hartwell replied. Her ladyship preferred to dismiss the footman herself. I proposed remaining, but she would have none of it. James, she said, when one requires sentry duty, one marries a soldier. We shall not turn my gallery into a barracks. A flicker at the corner of the mouth indicated the ghost of affectionate exasperation. I took a cab back to Eaton Terrace. I returned at 8:30 when Miss Meacham telephoned. You knew her habits. As one knows the clock, sir. Which is to say, she made her final tour alone. She touched each lamp, her way of thanking them for their service, she called it, extinguishing in sequence from the street windows inward. She disliked darkness falling behind her. He paused. She wore sapphires for an evening, yes, unless she intended an argument. Then she chose pearls. She had a notion that pearls made a barricade look like a necklace. Alleyn allowed the remark to settle. And last night? Pearls, Hartwell said. His eyes did not move. There was to be some disagreement over a canvas. The letter opener. If Hartwell felt any start, it did not reach his face. I have seen its like, he said carefully. In a gentleman's study some years past. Many families possess such pieces, sir. Forgive me, The initials might be read as MB. Hartwell's eyelids lowered, the smallest courtesy curtain. If one were inclined to read them so, sir, you aren't. I do not read in other people's drawers, sir. A fractional pause. Her ladyship did. Alleyn let it go. The butler's loyalty was not obstinate, but principled. To press would be to bruise it. The charwoman, Mrs. Baines, made her curtsy to the exigencies of the yard by sitting on the edge of the chair and clasping her bag as if it were a small dog that might take flight. She had a comfortable face, much used by laughter, and narrowed now in unhappiness. You were first through the doors with Miss Meacham. I were, sir. Beg pardon. Was. I comes by the side entrance with my bucket, only I never brings it past the green runner till Mr. Hartwell gives the nod. Her ladyship liked things to begin proper and end proper. It keeps the dust respectful. You notice everything, Alleyn said, and Mrs. Baines glowed a fraction. Well, floors talk if you listen. These carpets, they tell you whether a foot stepped quick or whether it thought first. She lowered her voice. Those pearls, sir. They didn't bounce under the skirting like they ought. They were set about, like when a child makes a pattern with beans on a plate. Neat they were. Her ladyship did neat, but not that kind. Hers was the neat you don't see. Any scent unusual to the room? Her eyes widened. Now you say it. Violets, sir. Not her ladyship's. She was a Rosewater lady. Violets is for young misses or actresses. The last word came out without malice, simply as a category. Thank you, Mrs. Baines. The porter, Mr. Copley, had a soldier's economy of word and movement. He stood rather than sat, cap in hand, and looked at the floor as if reading orders written into the grain. I set the alarm at 22:30, Inspector. Her ladyship took the key. I sleep in the basement room. Alarm board shows green. At 23:07 there was a chirp. Loop 3 bypassed. Loop 3? Private office corridor to the withdrawing room and the little door that gives to the mews, sir. Her ladyship sometimes bypassed when she wished to step out to air herself. In damp weather the alarm is nervous. He hesitated. Only a moment, but enough for a trained ear. She had a way of tapping the glass when the light stuck. 3 taps. I heard them once last night, or I thought I did. Could have been the pipes. And after? Nothing until morning. No doors forced. The mews door slides if you put your shoulder. Old wood swells. He swallowed. But I put a wedge there Wednesdays. Last night weren't Wednesday. Who besides Lady Vale held keys to the mews door? Miss Meacham has one for deliveries. Mr. Kettering had one while the show's on account of late returns. He added with a certain stubborn fairness. They sign, Inspector. Her ladyship liked signatures. Alleyn looked at the keyboard along the wall, brass hooks numbered and polished. One hook bore a faint rub, brighter than its fellows. The tag above read Muse, and the key hung there now, a trifle damp as if recently handled and wiped. Arthur Pym, the lighting boy, red hair that had known no barber since summer and a respectful fear of everything breakable, admitted to resetting 3 lamps after guests had trailed their admiration into absent-minded switches. Her ladyship liked the last lamp to be the one under the whistler, he said. Said good night to the house, like. But this morning it was the one by the Armand that was on. That's wrong, if I may say. Beg pardon. You may, Alleyn said. You have. He sent them away with thanks that were no less genuine for being formal, and stood alone in the narrow room where brooms made their humble confessions. The servants had drawn a careful perimeter around what they knew. Within it lay habit, ritual, slight deviations, pearls arranged rather than spilled, violets where rose ought to be, a lamp left wrong, a tap on the alarm glass, a key wiped and rehung with penitence or calculation. Fox, arriving with his quiet tread, found him looking at the orderly parade of tags and hooks. Useful? Fox asked. Very, said Alleyn. They have told us nothing and told us everything, which is precisely their art. He closed the door softly on the service corridor. and returned to the velvet hush. Somewhere within the choreography of Lady Imogen Vale's private rituals, a single misstep had been made. It would be impolite to point it out too soon, but when the time came, it would be impossible to ignore. The service passage behind the Grosvenors' gracious rooms had its own kind of quiet, practical, polished, faintly scented with beeswax and steam. Alleyn liked such places. Their simplicity relieved him after the languid tact of drawing rooms. He found James Hartwell in the small butler's pantry, sleeves narrowly folded, his long hands engaged upon the meaningless task of aligning teaspoons in parallel. "Mr. Hartwell," Alleyn said, with a civility that recognized rank in any hierarchy, "I should be grateful to learn how the house goes to sleep." Hartwell inclined his head, a gesture of service that managed, somehow, to preserve dignity. "Her ladyship took her final tour, sir. When the last guest had gone, she walked the rooms, north gallery through to the office, testing the window latches and the picture cords. She was particular about cords. 'Rooms have tempers,' she used to say. 'They loosen in the night unless one reminds them.' You accompanied her?" "No, sir. I followed after by a few minutes with the tea." A pause, delicately measured. "Lemon verbena. Her ladyship did not care for ordinary blends at night." Alleyn's glance moved to the small porcelain cup on the sideboard, washed and returned to its saucer with the precision of ritual. He lifted it, considered, and set it down again without comment. "She took the tea in here?" he asked. "In the office, sir. 1 cup only. Her ladyship preferred a moment alone before Mr. Kettering set the alarm." "Mr. Kettering set it?" Hartwell's eyelids lowered. "He likes to assure himself. I should not wish to contradict the gentleman." Which was as far, Alleyn thought, as Hartwell intended to go. He had the unyielding reticence of one who believed loyalty a creed rather than a convenience. Yet even creeds had edges one might trace with a fingertip. "Lady Vale's wedding ring," Alleyn observed, "turned inward." "Yes, sir. She did that when she found fault. It was a habit with her ladyship. Not temper, correction. She had intended to wear sapphires yesterday evening. I laid them out. They were returned to the safe and the pearls taken instead." A fractional hesitation. Unusual. Who had access to the safe? "Her ladyship," Hartwell said. "And Mr. Kettering officially. Miss Meacham has the list." The spoon alignment achieved, he straightened them again. "Sir Marcus, on occasion, when items were lent for charitable functions. Under supervision." Alleyn let that rest. "The letter opener," he said after a moment. "You have seen its like." Hartwell's gaze did not quite meet his. "In houses, sir, one sees many things. Engravers are much of a muchness with flourishes." "M.B. can stand for more than one gentleman," Alleyn conceded. "Still one remembers the weight of a handle in the hand sometimes." "Sometimes," Hartwell echoed, and returned to his spoons. Fox appeared in the doorway, bearing the sober satisfaction of a man who had found something he had been told did not exist. "The cleaner's bin, sir," he murmured. "A rag, spirits on it, grease too." "Bring me the cleaner," Alleyn said. Mrs. Trowse, the morning woman, arrived with a cap like a small white crown and a respect that was neither servile nor impressed. "I don't hold with mess, sir," she announced. "I found that rag tucked behind one of them plinths. Not our doing. It smelt of gin and a kind of paint. I put it by, but then the constable said as how all was to be left. So I told Mr. Fox." "Kind of paint?" "Ladies' stuff," Mrs. Trowse said bluntly. "Grease, stagey. What actresses wipe off, begging your pardon. And a bit of black on it, like from gloves gone damp." "Black gloves?" "The sort as goes with evening," Mrs. Trowse said, and closed her mouth upon the subject as neatly as if it were a cupboard she kept locked. Alleyn thanked her and sent her away. The rag lay on the table, ordinary and ugly amid the gallery's refinements. He did not touch it. The faint, fat sweetness of cold cream lingered. There was also, he thought, a bite of something sharper, the clean, ruthless smell of metal polish. On the subject of polish, he said mildly to Hartwell, the letter opener, if one polished it recently, one might smell the proof. Hartwell's silence deepened into a sort of negative statement. "Silver wants attendance, sir," he said at last. "If it is to be seen." "Just so." Alleyn allowed the line to go slack. The porter, Parsons, answered the next summons with the weary probity of a man who had kept doors against the public for 30 years. He wore his uniform like an argument. "You saw the last guests out?" Alleyn asked. "Yes, sir. Mr. Davenant went early, 5 to 11. Colonel Weatherby and Miss Carstairs stood in the vestibule making the talk of leave-taking. Sir Marcus had Mr. Kettering in a grip about some paper or other. Dr. Lyon, she don't waste words. Miss Arkwright waited near the cloakroom, very quiet. And after? The house was near still. The service lift ran around midnight. Parsons frowned as if at a disobedient piece of machinery. Shouldn't have. The mechanism's noisy, like a tin tray in a well. No one rung it from the hall. Them as has keys might ring from below. Below? The basement, sir. Offices, the little archive, the side door for trades. Side door secured? Turned and bolted by myself at 11:15. But it's a clever old door. It will sit looking locked when it's not, if the bolt's not set to the second notch. I don't say that happened last night, sir. I only say a door can be as sly as a person. It was the nearest to opinion that Porter would allow himself. Alleyn thanked him and made a note to look at the bolt. "Mr. Hartwell," he said finally, "was there anything about last night that was out of place? Not wrong, perhaps, but not done in the usual order?" Hartwell considered. Her ladyship usually wound the French clock in the office at 10, exactly. She preferred not to hear it striking while guests were present. Last night it was still. I wound it myself at 10 past when I found it waiting. What time had it stopped? 12:11, sir. Hartwell's tone was almost apologetic. But French clocks lie when they please. I shouldn't care to swear to it. No, Alleyn said softly. Nor should I care to refuse the lie altogether. He stood for a moment, listening to the practical heartbeat of the back passages, the hiss of a kettle somewhere, the distant murmur of a constable in the front hall, the world's business resuming itself around a deliberate interruption. The servants had given him facts wrapped in discretion, small resistances that spoke of loyalty as much as fear. Yet beneath their careful omissions, he had felt the shape of something living. A broken habit, a sly door, a lift that moved when no one called it, a cloth that carried two incompatible scents. He would look next, he told himself, not for objects, but for rituals. Houses did have tempers, as Lady Vale had said. Tempers were made of what one always did, until one did not. The afternoon drew a thin veil over the Grosvenor Gallery, softening edges and lending the rooms a monastic quiet. Alleyn, who had learned to let places speak before coaxing confessions from people, returned to the central salon with Fox at his shoulder, and James Hartwell summoned, reluctantly, from the regions below stairs. "Mr. Hartwell," Alleyn said with his customary ease, "I should like you to show me precisely how Lady Vale concluded an evening. One imagines she conducted the gallery as a captain does a ship." The butler, who carried dignity as some men carry a standard, permitted himself a single, measured inclination. "Her ladyship was exact, sir." He began at the windows, drawing up each blind a fraction to ensure the latch had taken, smoothing the cord as he went. He touched, with reverent thumb, the gilt label beneath the Whistler, moved on to the arm end with a slight tightening about the mouth, and paused beneath the velvet shadow. "Here, sir," Hartwell said. "Her ladyship would look longest. She disliked irregularities. Dust on the rail, a buckle out of square. The silk cord." He indicated the braided burgundy that had so lightly misbehaved at the private view. "She would set it right, and, if the tassel had swung, align it. 12 o'clock to the floor, as she said." Alleyn regarded the tassel, its silk fringe pointed, not as a straight drop, but canted a whisker toward the French doors. And now? Not as it should be, Hartwell said after a fractional hesitation. Is there any circumstance, Alleyn inquired, under which Lady Vale might have left it so? No, sir. Fox, having the eye for small economies of movement, bent to the skirting board. Scuff here, sir. Fresh. It was a fine crescent rubbed into the polish, barely visible, just under the bell pull to the right of the central painting. The pull itself, of velvet to match the walls, hung with a tired slant. Alleyn touched it with a handkerchief and felt the faintest drag of dust. He had the impression of something used rarely, and not by the person who usually presided here. She did not ring for staff once the house was closed? He asked. Never, sir, Hartwell replied. After hours, she would not disturb the footmen. Her ladyship believed in concluding matters herself. Alleyn let that settle. There were other small departures from habit that, taken singly, might mean nothing. The gloves folded on the occasional table rather than tucked, as Miss Meacham had testified, into the handbag. The guest book left open when Lady Vale, by immemorial practice, closed it and replaced the pen at a precise right angle upon its tray. He examined the pen now. A ring of blue-black ink had dried on the lip of the well, a thin moon unbroken. No pen had kissed it since the previous evening. The fountain pen itself lay uncapped, its nib faintly clogged, as if a hand had been arrested mid-act. Hartwell, in Lady Vale's office. Her keys, Alleyn said. I'm told she kept them upon a board. They went next door, into the neat little sanctum where order reigned with quiet tyranny. The keyboard was a simple thing of velvet and brass hooks, each key tagged in Lady Vale's careful hand. Alleyn let his gaze drift over the sequence: front door, French doors, side stair, office safe, alarm cabinet, upper passage. A small space yawned between alarm cabinet and upper passage, an absence as eloquent as any presence. Which is missing? Hartwell's mouth flattened. The side door to the Mews passage, sir. Her ladyship kept the key here after hours. During a function, I would hold it. And last night? Returned to its place before I left, sir. Fox made a small note. The room held its breath. Even the timepiece on the mantel, a modest French carriage clock, ticked with a softer discretion. Alleyn stepped to the alarm cabinet. Its glass door showed the dials and their small, unquestioning certainties. The system logs when set and unset? Yes, sir, Hartwell admitted, with the air of a man confessing to a mildly indecorous modernity. A scrap of newness in an old house. The paper tape, when Fox drew it forward, displayed its punctures. 11:38 p.m. Interior, set. 11:41 p.m. Perimeter, set. There was no record of an unset between then and Miss Meacham's call. So, Alleyn said, as if the matter were of passing interest, either Lady Vale did not complete her usual round, or she did and someone undid it for her. He returned to the salon, standing once more before the velvet shadow. The pearls, those compliant little moons, had been gathered for the laboratory, but a faint impression remained where one had rested against the carpet nap and left a pale dent. He offered no comment. Instead, he looked up at the portrait, the woman half obscured by light's caprice, the painted eyes that watched and knew. Mr. Hartwell, he said, when Lady Vale was displeased, how did she wear her ring? Inward, sir, Hartwell said. His face, for the first time, betrayed a grief that was personal. She would not show the world what she would not endure. Alleyn thanked him and let the butler go. When the door had closed, Fox said, pointing tassel, missing key, bell pull used, pen uncapped, alarm set. A good many small no, sirs. Yes, Alleyn said. One grows fond of small no, sirs. They make a sort of music, Fox. He allowed himself then to take from the edge of the skirting, aided by the point of a pocket knife, a minuscule thread, caught where the bell pull brushed the wood. It was of pale silk, very fine, and smelt faintly of something crisp and impersonal. Starch, or face powder. He put it away. Outside, a cart rattled along the mews with a domestic clatter. Within, the portrait's velvet shadow deepened as the light thinned. A routine had been broken with the tact of a polite lie. The question, Alleyn thought, was not what had been done, but who knew well enough to do it so. Toward evening, a constable brought a note addressed in a thick, formal hand to Miss Meacham. It had been delivered without a messenger's name. Fox raised an eyebrow. Alleyn considered the envelope for a moment, listening to that small, insistent music of broken habits, and said, "Let us have Miss Meacham, if you please." By evening, the gallery had resumed its unnatural calm, the hush of a house that has learned to hold its breath. Constables moved with deliberate care. Fox's large presence absorbed fuss as a hedge takes wind. Alleyn, who distrusted haste in rooms that remembered people, walked once more the polite circuit Lady Imogen had made her own, letting the space speak in its small, obstinate way. The tassel of the velvet shadow still angled slightly toward the French doors. The skirting showed its small crescent scuff. The guest book, immobilized mid-ritual, lay beside the uncapped pen with its clot of dried ink. The bronze lamp near the office remained a negative, what it had not done declaring itself more than anything it might have done. Custom, he thought, is the grammar of such households. Break the grammar, and the sentence betrays its author. Fox joined him with a sheet of the alarm tape neatly folded. "No change, sir. Interior at 11:38. Perimeter at 11:41. Nothing touched till morning." And yet Lady Vale was still abroad in her own temple after that point, if we take the meeting note at its face, Alleyn said, unless the note served another purpose, or the meeting took place in a zone the system forgot to count. Fox's brow furrowed. The anteroom? He had the map of the place by heart already. Old wing. The electrician said the interior loop skips the little passage where they put the cloak stand, on account of plaster and wire lath. Alleyn's eyes rested on the bell pull. A house half modernized is a character in its own right. It keeps secrets out of sheer habit. He sent for Hartwell. The butler, composed within his carefully mended grief, stood like a standard of all that had been correct here. Alleyn, who liked good servants for the quiet courage of their trade, indicated the pearls in their evidence box. Where did Lady Vale keep such things? In the desk strong-box, sir. Her ladyship preferred to wear sapphires. Pearls for very few occasions. His gaze did not waver, yet the line of his mouth tightened. The clasp of these is not Mr. Treadgold's work. You would know his hand. I would, sir. Mr. Treadgold uses fine French wire and an invisible safety. This is a common fish hook, and the stringing, too taut. A lady's neck leaves a memory in silk. When Hartwell had gone, Fox said, "Common clasp." Odd message. A grand lady receives an anonymous gift with the fittings of a draper's counter. Sometimes the costume tells you more than the actor, Alleyn murmured. His mind ranged backwards through the afternoon. Miss Meacham's careful elisions, Kettering's sleek nervousness, Helena's beautiful composure with its small, bright cracks, Felix's boyish candor that did not quite equal transparency, Sir Marcus's measured public sorrow, Dr. Lyon's sudden seclusion at the exact moment her expertise had become inconvenient, Camilla Arkwright, the outsider with an insider's eye, seeing things the born participants had ceased to register. Ambition, he thought, seldom announces itself in its true voice. It borrows the tone of principle, of loyalty, of distress for cultural standard. And then there was money, the kind attached to signatures and to the confidence that signatures engender. The Armand paper with its elegant facsimile loops lay cool and smooth under his fingers in memory. The letter opener, that M.B. engraved with honesty almost too pure, thrust between the shoulder blades with the discretion of a medical cut. Too apt, too tidy. Sir Marcus, he said aloud, and let the name rest on the air. Not accusation, merely a weight among others on the scale. He asked Fox for the messenger's book from the previous day. The porter's neat entries told their own polite tale. 2 deliveries at 4, one from Mr. Kettering's office, one from B with no address, another at 6, from a jeweller's to Mr. Kettering personally, signed for by Miss Meacham. The chain hung there without quite making a necklace. "Send the pearls to Mr. Treadgold with my compliments," Alleyn said. "Ask him for an opinion on age and stringing, not value. And the letter paper of our anonymous counsellor. Have records look at recent theatre correspondence. There is a quality of phrasing that belongs to the stage." Fox's mouth twitched. "Miss Carstairs? She's not the only person who has learned to make words do the work of tears." He paused. "But yes, I should like to hear her voice when she is not in costume." He returned to the painting. The woman in The Velvet Shadow, half lost in chiaroscuro, had the confidential expression of someone who knows a scandal and has not decided yet whether to tell it. Lady Vale had stood here each night, making order from beauty. What had broken that old habit? Fear, duty, the sudden imperative of a discovery one cannot unmake. He pictured the last hour in sequences that moved without hurry. The guests thinning, the front door closing with its precise click. Hartwell dismissed at 11:15. A voice at the top of the stair. Betty's sharp-like exchange. Lady Vale's ring turned inward, the guest book waiting for its little V, the pen uncapped. Then another ritual interposed, one not hers. A meeting in the anteroom, perhaps, in the gallery's blind spot, conducted in good breeding's low tones. A gift worn to signify trust, or to test it. The small shift of a tassel, the steadying hand that made that shallow scuff along the skirting as the body eased down. The letter opener selected for its neatness, or its initials, or both. "Not rage," he said softly. "Not even panic. Something colder. Efficiency imposed upon sentiment." Fox looked at him inquiringly. "The motive will not lie in one thing," Alleyn added. "It will sit where reputation meets money, and old loyalties are asked to change their shape." He left instructions that no one connected with the exhibition was to leave town. A note went out to Sir Marcus requesting a word at his club, couched in terms that made refusal impolite. Another, gentler invitation asked Miss Carstairs and Mr. Kettering to attend the gallery in the morning for a brief reconstruction, a domestic word that offends no one. Dr. Lyon, if her health permitted, could offer her scholar's eye from a chair. He asked also for Miss Meacham and Hartwell to be present, not as audience, but as the gallery's memory. When at last he stepped into the cool night, the city breathed its ordinary, indifferent breath. Behind him the velvet hung heavy, and the painted faces had resumed their placid stare. His mind, which often played with solutions too early, chose instead to let the powder of impressions settle. By morning the pattern would show where it had lighted, and with it, perhaps, the hand that had shaken the Sèvres. Rain began in the late afternoon, a thin, courteous veil that blurred Mayfair's angles without disturbing its composure. At 7, the Grosvenor Gallery was lamplit once more, the burgundy walls absorbing light with their customary discretion. Alleyn, who disliked the theatricals of public dénouements, had asked those most closely concerned to return, no more than a handful, on the pretext of a final formality. They came with the curious obedience of people who sense that nuance, rather than noise, will determine their fate. Sir Marcus Blackwood, controlled to a hair, Helena Carstairs, beautifully subdued in black crepe, Basil Kettering, all professional suavity stretched a shade thin, Felix Davenant, pale and intent, Miss Meacham, neatness itself, her brown eyes tired yet clear. Hartwell stood by the door with the secure gravity of a butler in his rightful element. "Thank you for humoring me," Alleyn said, his voice pitched for civility, not command. "I propose a small reconstruction, nothing dramatic, merely a rehearsal of custom. He turned to Hartwell. "If you please." "The evening round, as Lady Vale preferred it." Hartwell complied. The ritual a poem learned in youth. He smoothed cords, checked latches, paused at each portrait. At the velvet shadow, his gloved thumb touched the gilt label. The tassel hung still, dutifully aligned. When he had done, Alleyn inclined his head and, without speaking, flicked his gaze to Kettering. The impresario hesitated the briefest fraction. "I rarely, well, of course." He moved, with a passable imitation of Hartwell's economy, and made the circuit. Twice he corrected himself. The window latch in the south bay, the bell pulls slack at the French doors. His fingers, as if by second nature, straightened the tassel to 12 o'clock. Helena's eyes flickered, not at the gesture itself, but at the ease with which it was performed. "Thank you," Alleyn said. "A craftsman's hand, Mr. Kettering. It is rather a knack, knowing how another's habits sit in a room." "A gallery, Inspector," Kettering replied, the smile returning like a man retrieving a hat caught by wind. "One absorbs one's patron's preferences, or one does not keep one's post." "Quite," Alleyn said mildly. He crossed to the writing desk where the guest book lay open. Lady Vale marked her evenings with a private sign. He touched the blank space beneath last night's names. Not placed, therefore either interrupted or replaced. He turned a page and produced a single sheet, the anonymous letter delivered to Miss Meacham. "There is a style here, a certain fondness for cadence. Would you indulge me? One line only. The price of knowledge is not always paid in coin. Write precisely that. It is not handwriting I wish to see, but the hesitation before ink meets paper." They did as bid. Miss Meacham wrote at once, the neat clerkly hand of a woman who had spent her life in ordered script. Sir Marcus took longer, and when he set down the pen, his mouth was set in such a way as to suggest the line offended him by its sententiousness. Kettering flourished an elegant loop upon the final D before checking himself. Helena smiled, an involuntary stage instinct, then suppressed it and wrote with economical grace. Felix wrote carefully, lips moving as actors' lips do when the mind counts beats. Alleyn gathered the slips as if they were menu cards and let them rest beneath his palm. "A trifle," he said. "We make patterns of our pauses." He looked at Sir Marcus. "The letter opener. Your late wife's initials." Sir Marcus's composure altered, not by breaking but by setting. "I have not denied its resemblance. The piece went missing years ago. If it has reappeared here, it did so without my knowledge." "Yet you knew to look at it," Alleyn said without emphasis. "A gentleman notices family silver," Sir Marcus returned, and for a moment the old world looked at the new and found it wanting. Hartwell coughed discreetly. "Inspector, if I may, her ladyship's side door key has been restored to its hook." There was the slight stress that makes a statement a question. "Has it?" Alleyn's eyebrows made a traveller's lift. "When did you first observe its return?" "This afternoon, sir. It was absent at 10. Kettering's attention fixed so intently on the tassel he might have willed it to swing. Helena watched him watching. Felix examined his own hands with a frown as if they had misled him in some trivial task. Miss Meacham, after the smallest pause, said, "I restored it, on Mr. Kettering's direction." Kettering's head turned a degree too quickly. "Miss Meacham, I said nothing of the sort." "You suggested," she said evenly, "that anything misplaced should be made right before the inspector's return." She looked at Alleyn. "I found the key in the umbrella stand, Inspector. It is not where keys belong." "Indeed not," Alleyn murmured. "But they do travel." He let a silence fall and permitted it to expand until it touched each face. The alarm tape records a system set at 20 to 12 in 2 stages. Some doors can be isolated if one has the proper key and a little nerve. It is a habit, like aligning a tassel or turning a ring. Those who live by ritual may be guided by it. Those who depend upon it may be betrayed. Helena's voice came gently. "Do you intend to accuse us all, Inspector, by courtesy? Or only to soften the moment for the one you mean?" "I dislike accusations," Alleyn said. "They produce noise. I prefer an invitation." He stood. "Thank you. That will be all for tonight." Then, as the small party turned with audible breaths of private relief and private fear, he added, as if remembering a minor point of housekeeping, "Sir Marcus, Mr. Kettering, if you could remain a few minutes, I should be grateful." The rain ticked against the tall panes. In the gallery, the portraits kept their counsel. Within the narrow, polite space that remained, something, not yet confession, not yet collapse, made ready to speak. The morning returned the gallery to its hush, but the silence felt newly intentional, as if the room had decided to assist the inquiry by withholding noise. Alleyn arrived early, his step unhurried, his glance taking in the minor alterations of a place that had been lived in by police through the night. Fox had already made his rounds with the constables and departed with a list of errands that looked like trifles and would prove otherwise. Alleyn preferred emptiness for what he intended. He had asked Sir Marcus Blackwood to call before the day's formalities began. The baronet entered with a quiet that might have been humility or carefulness. He removed his gloves with the deliberate economy of a man who disliked wasting movement in any realm, moral or physical. "Thank you for coming," Alleyn said. "I wonder if you would look at this again." He indicated the letter opener within its envelope. The initials glimmered faintly through the glassine. Sir Marcus regarded them without flinching. "I told you, it resembles one that was my wife's. I will not deny it, but I have not seen that piece in years." "You came late last evening and left." "How?" Alleyn continued conversationally, as if discussing the merits of a club chef. "By the front door. I heard a bell as I crossed the hall, one of those old servants' bell pulls. Strange how sound carries in an empty house." He hesitated. "Lady Vale was displeased with me, Inspector. We had disagreed about certain loans. She suspected a questionable provenance in a portrait I had facilitated years ago. She was correct to question it." "Did you feel yourself blackmailed?" "No." A pause. "Merely found out." The admission landed with the lightest possible weight. "I told her I would make restitution. I left. I believed she would sleep on it and forgive me for being an old fool." Alleyn nodded and let the silence do its work. Sir Marcus, perhaps grateful for it, took himself off, leaving behind the particular fragrance of good wool and older worries. Alleyn stood a moment longer by the velvet shadow, then asked Hartwell for his hat and the car. Dr. Evaden Lyon's lodgings lay in a proper, narrow house that wore its respectability like a well-brushed coat. The landlady, inquiring and maternal, announced that her tenant was abed and oughtn't to be bothered, which was an edict Dr. Lyon herself overruled in a thin voice from the stair. She received Alleyn in a dim bedroom with scrupulously tidy books on the bedside table and a glass of water positioned at a perfect right angle to the lamp. "Forgive the drama," she said with wry effort. "I have no patience for nerves. Mine have acquired a will of their own." "May I ask one question that will not try them?" Alleyn seated himself like a guest in a museum chair. "You spoke of pearls to Lady Vale, did you not?" Dr. Lyon removed her pince-nez as if conceding a point in an academic debate. "Not pearls, Inspector. Beads. An old trick among restorers. A cheap string with a varnish sensitivity wash. The string darkens under certain vapors. It is a way of testing whether a studio aged its canvases with theatrical expedients. I told Lady Vale that if a particular dealer had handled the Armand portrait, he also dealt in such strings. She laughed, once, and asked me to send her the name. I did. And then you were taken ill. I was advised," Dr. Lyon said carefully, "that my reputation could be unmade more easily than a forgery. I took to my bed out of self-preservation." Alleyn thanked her and left with the particular satisfaction that comes when a corner folds neatly against the square it should have been part of all along. He turned next to the Mayfair's stage door. Helena Carstairs appeared in a dark coat that declared itself modest and managed to be dramatic. She received the news that he wished a word, as if accepting an opening night bouquet she had not expected and would not refuse. "You wrote a letter yesterday," Alleyn said, as they walked slowly along the shadowed corridor lined with sepia photographs. "Not to Lady Vale, not to me. Anonymity sat on it like powder on a face. You cautioned someone about the price of knowledge. It was kind of you." Her smile tilted. "It was prudent of me. Prudence is an old friend on whom actresses eventually rely. Sir Marcus was a patron. Mr. Kettering an impresario whose goodwill may not be entirely for sale, but can be rented." Lady Vale understood these economies. She did not resent them. She preferred them out of doors. "You were here late the night of the private view." "I was. I left at 11. Colonel Weatherby saw me out. He counted the strokes of St. Jude's clock as if we were in a novel. He has a fondness for exactitude." "Did you see Felix Davenant?" "I saw a young man discovering that charm is not currency everywhere." Helena's eyes were kind. "He's too new to know the arithmetic." Back at the gallery, Alleyn asked Fox to fetch Basil Kettering at his convenience. Basil came promptly, the actor's resonance in his voice replaced by a more brittle pitch. Alleyn suggested tea in Lady Vale's withdrawing room. Basil accepted as if he feared it might be an audition. "I shall be straightforward," Alleyn murmured, pouring. "You had serviceable reasons to fear Lady Vale's scruples. Dr. Lyon had identified methods familiar to certain dealers. A string of experimental beads has a way of finding its way back to the studio that lacquers time." Kettering paled, then rallied beneath a practiced smile. "Inspector, scholarship is a wonderful thing. It can also be overexcited. I've managed exhibitions for 20 years without a breath of scandal." "Scandal is a vulgar word," Alleyn said. "We will not use it. We will speak instead of arrangements. You arrange this exhibition. You arrange the insurance. You arrange the guest list and the lighting. Did you arrange also for Lady Vale to receive a string of pearls by messenger?" Kettering's cup rattled once, a small betrayal that seemed to fatigue him. "No," he said, and the denial, while not convincing, was not entirely false. "The art world abounds in gestures." "Indeed. One must choose one's gestures very carefully." Alleyn let him go with thanks and courtesies. He stood a moment in the doorway, considering the room with its pale walls and the photograph of the country house in silver frame. A world of rituals, some kept, some broken. Before the day closed, he asked Hartwell to invite everyone to the gallery at 6 the next evening. "A brief gathering," he said, "no more than a quarter of an hour. We owe Lady Vale a civilized conclusion." Hartwell inclined his head in grave assent. The invitation went out. The velvet walls waited. And somewhere in that quiet interval, the shape of the truth, long sensed, half seen, resolved itself with the unconscious elegance of a portrait finally stepped back from and understood. They gathered in the withdrawing room at Alleyn's quiet request. Sir Marcus with his careful dignity intact, Helena Carstairs composed and still, Basil Kettering attentive, his thin hands folded, Miss Measham very straight in her brown dress, and Felix Davenant with the strained politeness of a young man who has rehearsed too many versions of truth. The late afternoon had given way to that blue-grey hour, when London's light seems to withdraw from interiors and leave character in relief. Fox stood near the mantel, immovable as a well-bred piece of furniture. Alleyn, who disliked altogether unnecessary flourishes, began without preamble. "I've asked you here to spare you the disagreeable business of public interrogation. Lady Imogen Vale was killed by someone who knew her habits, valued her sense of order, and trusted to it. The method was not melodramatic. It was correct, almost as if it had been selected to pay her a perverse compliment." He let that rest, then turned a little toward the door, as if acknowledging the gallery beyond. Her last ritual, her inspection, was interrupted. The bronze lamp by her office was not lit. The guest book bore no private initial, yet the alarm tape records interior set at 11:38, perimeter at 41. That is the grammar of deceit if you know how to read it. Someone killed her, then set the alarm and went out, using the exit delay as their curtain. Basil shifted. It was the sort of movement that would have passed unnoticed at a cocktail party, but stood out in a room bereaved of chatter. The side door key, Alleyn continued, had been in its place when Mr. Hartwell left. Later, it was returned. That small gap on the keyboard between alarm cabinet and upper passage spoke as clearly as a confession to anyone who lives by such order. The side door's cylinder has an old-fashioned bypass plate. It accepts a special key to isolate the contact for servicing. I imagine, Mr. Kettering, that you know this. Basil's smile stiffened at the edges. I manage the gallery's practicalities. It is my office to know. Just so. Alleyn walked to the writing table, touching nothing. Lady Vale had intended to withdraw a certain portrait at Dr. Lyon's suggestion. She was not frightened of embarrassment. She was frightened of fraud. The pearls she wore were sent the same afternoon. Anonymous, a sentimental lure. She would never have chosen them. Their clasp was cheap, the stringing poor. But she wore them because the accompanying note invoked an old friend and a memory of the original Grosvenor days, words lifted nearly verbatim from the founder's 1888 catalogue, whose marked copy you kept in your drawer. Miss Meacham glanced involuntarily at Basil. Helena said very quietly, "You assume a great deal, Inspector." "I prefer to call it reading." He turned the envelope in his fingers. The anonymous letter to Miss Meacham. This, with its expensive paper and anxious disguise, was meant to produce confusion today. It speaks in the argot of performance. Miss Carstairs, you might have been suspected of it, but the watermark is of the same batch Mr. Kettering used for his donor letters, and the faint stump of a printer's misfeed along the edge matches the defect in the gallery stationery. One may change one's hand. One rarely alters one's paper. Basil's hands unclasped, then reassembled as if seeking a safer formation. I wrote to steady the staff. It was a dreadful morning. You wrote to blur a line that was already too distinct, Alleyn said gently. You had much to lose. The Armand would not have survived Dr. Lyon's scrutiny. The insurance was the rope by which the exhibition hung. Lady Vale intended to cut it. Your conversation with her after the guests left will have been short and, given her character, decisive. You arranged the pearls after the deed because you understood she preferred order to vulgarity. You used a silver letter opener engraved M.B. to point me toward Sir Marcus. You handled it last week when unpacking the Blackwood donation for the charity sale, the set of desk trifles that never reached the catalogue. Sir Marcus's late wife's initials lent a convenient direction to suspicion. Sir Marcus, who had been very still, stirred with something like pain rather than outrage. That donation, my steward had carte blanche. I did not suppose... You had not supposed that a staging would be arranged with your family's props, Alleyn said. Mr. Kettering staged other things. During the private view, he disturbed the silk cord beneath the velvet shadow, the fresh scuff on the skirting marks where he braced to reach the pull. He knew Lady Vale would set it to rights during her last round. He meant the painting to be the place. Felix spoke then, a little hoarsely. He told me to leave Alleyn. He met me in the anteroom and said Lady Vale was engaged. He said to call tomorrow. I believed him. I don't doubt you did, Alleyn replied. You were to be the noise offstage. The real business was conducted by a man who knew the alarm delays and the keyboard, who could reproduce a tone of the past, and who was already balancing his ledgers against disaster. Basil rose, then sat again, the movement tidy, almost formal. It was not meant to be this, he said at last. I had thought she was alone. We could agree upon a postponement. She said the word withdraw, and my world became a very small room with no doors. Helena closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer. Miss Meacham's hands tightened on her handkerchief. Sir Marcus looked at the carpet. Alleyn's voice, when it came, was almost kind. "You'll come with us quietly, Mr. Kettering." "Fox?" Fox moved with his silent certainty. Basil stood, and in that moment looked oddly relieved, as if at last a part had been taken from him that he had never learned to play. The gallery, closed now to the public and to its own former certainties, had acquired the hush of a church after a funeral. In that stillness the inspector walked once more along the burgundy walls, not as investigator, but as a guest paying respectful farewell. A dull afternoon light lay against the tall panes. Outside, the street moved on with London's practical indifference. Within, rooms remembered. He paused before the central portrait. The woman in the velvet shadow retained her oblique gaze, a composition of concealment and acknowledgement that had become, over these days, a kind of mirror. It struck him that Lady Vale had curated her last scene with the same unflustered exactitude she had brought to her dinners and committees. Even in the manner of dying she had insisted upon a kind of order, and he, arriving after the fact, had simply read the arrangement. He found the withdrawing room as they had left it, the silver frame turned face down by some well-meaning hand, the writing table stripped to sober neatness, the small bronze lamp with its pleated shade set in perfect alignment to the blotter's edge. He touched the switch. The filament woke. The pleats gathered a modest aureole. He thought of that other evening, of the lamp's refusal then to play its accustomed part, and how, in the delicate economy of such households, the smallest defection could signal catastrophe. A footfall in the corridor announced the butler. Hartwell entered with a tray and the gravitas of one who would keep his posts through flood or siege. He set down the tea and, with the same small bow, with which once he had acknowledged titled guests, asked if he might correct a minor disorder in the main room. The inspector assented. Hartwell returned a moment later, faintly breathless, having righted the tassel beneath the central frame to its doctrinal 12 o'clock. A square of polish shone where a crescent had been. The gesture, practical, affectionate, seemed to close a chapter. "There will be sales," Hartwell said quietly, "and removals. Mrs. Pemberton has gone to her sister's at Kew for the time. Miss Meacham, well, sir, she has been offered a temporary berth by the committee at Truro. It is good work. She will keep her counsel." He withdrew. The inspector took the offered cup and let the steam rise like a modest benediction. It was not a case to leave triumph behind it. Those who require triumph in such matters are better suited to other narratives. What remained was the recognition, always faintly chastening, that honesty is seldom clean, and that the innocent, when they are not protected, make complicated witnesses of themselves. He thought of the letters. One, with its theatrical caution for the innocent, had arrived too late to alter the course of events. Another, folded into the velvet-bound catalogue, had summoned a young actor to a conversation that came to nothing and left its noise behind. Words are obedient servants in drawing-rooms. They become ambiguous when asked to carry contrition. Reputations, too, had submitted to their adjustments. Sir Marcus had sent a wreath without card, perhaps understanding that vindication wears better if it is unadvertised. Dr. Lyon, now recovered and brittle as glass, would sit 3 afternoons a week among the catalogues, replacing speculation with notes in a hand that refused flourish. The theatre season would proceed with less largesse. Miss Carstairs would find in austerity a renewed severity of style that audiences might misread as inspiration. As for the young ones, Mr. Davenant and Miss Arkwright, he suspected they would discover, in a few years' time, that this ugly interval had taught them both something essential about grace under diminishment. Of Mr. Kettering he reserved only a measured pity. There is a species of deception that clothes itself in the language of preservation. It can look almost noble at a distance. Up close, it stains the fingers. He rose and went once more into the central room. Hartwell stood by the doors, awaiting dismissal he would not take until compelled. Together, without remark, they looked up. With the tassel cured of its errant slant, the portrait had lost a faint, unsettling skew. The composition returned to its intended balance. One could almost hear Lady Vale's small, satisfied intake of breath at a detail set right. "Will you lock up now?" he asked. "If you are done, sir." "I am done." In the corridor, he switched off the lamp. The brief oval of light climbed the shade and vanished. The room accepted. It's dusk. As he reached the outer steps, a thin drift of rain began, more a suggestion than a fall, softening edges, making the city's hard lines appear provisional. He put up his umbrella and stood a moment to watch the water purl upon the silk. It beaded and then, unresisting, slipped away. There was paperwork yet, and the slow civic business of aftermath. But the case itself had reached that point he knew well, when the living resume their private negotiations with memory and the dead are left to their last, unanswerable dignity. He descended to the pavement and walked on, thinking not of villains and victims, but of habit, of small lamps and initials inscribed at the foot of a page and tassels held to the noon position as if to steady the day. The city gathered him back. Behind him, the velvet walls retained their color in the dark. If a ghost remained in those rooms, it was made not of fear, but of standards, a presence that asked, very quietly, for things to be as they ought. Inspector Alleyn returned to the Grosvenor Gallery one last time as winter settled over London, its bare branches casting delicate shadows across windows now shrouded in dust sheets. The building stood empty, yet somehow expectant, as if awaiting final judgment on the drama that had unfolded within its burgundy-walled sanctuary. He moved through the familiar spaces with the measured pace of someone taking leave of significant places. The central position where the velvet shadow had hung showed only a pale rectangle on the silk, an absence more eloquent than presence. The authentication papers had been removed as evidence. The guest book closed forever, yet something essential lingered, not supernatural presence, but the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences accepted. Standing where Lady Vale had died, Alleyn contemplated the particular irony of Kettering's stated motivation. The impresario had genuinely believed himself a guardian of beauty, preserving masterpieces that might otherwise deteriorate in careless hands. Yet his methods had corrupted the very concept he sought to protect, transforming preservation into deception, stewardship into theft. The forged pieces, so skillfully executed, had been tributes to the originals they replaced, perfect in every detail, save authenticity itself. This paradox lay at the heart of the tragedy. Beauty divorced from truth became mere ornament, however exquisite its appearance. Lady Vale had understood this instinctively, her refusal to compromise stemming not from rigid principle but from recognition that authenticity and beauty were inseparable. The portraits that had witnessed the evening's events were gone now, dispersed to museums and private collections where they would continue their silent vigil over human folly and aspiration. Yet their presence lingered in memory, painted eyes that had observed the intersection of art and ambition, beauty and betrayal. Alleyn found himself thinking of Camilla Arkwright, whose artist's sensitivity had noticed details others had missed, the scattered pearls' deliberate arrangement, Lady Vale's characteristic gesture of turning her wedding ring inward when displeased. Such observations required not merely technical skill, but emotional intelligence, the capacity to read human nature through its smallest expressions. The case had raised questions that extended far beyond individual guilt or innocence. Where was the line between curatorial responsibility and criminal fraud? Could the preservation of irreplaceable beauty justify deception, even if it stopped short of murder? How should society balance the demands of scholarly precision against the practical needs of cultural preservation? These philosophical concerns would outlast legal proceedings, challenging all who worked among beautiful things to examine their own relationships between ambition and principle. Lady Vale's uncompromising integrity had cost her life, yet it had also ensured that such questions would be asked with renewed urgency. As afternoon light faded beyond the tall windows, Alleyn understood that some mysteries transcended criminal investigation. The deeper questions raised by Lady Vale's death about the price of moral courage, the relationship between beauty and truth, the dangerous intersection of idealism and desperation, would continue resonating long after the immediate participants had been forgotten. Moving to the bronze lamp that had marked the end of Lady Vale's evening ritual, he touched the switch with deliberate ceremony. The small circle of light collapsed without fuss, the velvet walls deepening by a shade. In that simple gesture lay acknowledgement of endings and beginnings, of truth revealed and beauty preserved through sacrifice. Outside, London continued its ancient rhythm, outwardly unchanged by the elegant tragedy that had unfolded in this sanctuary of culture. Yet something had shifted in the city's moral landscape, a reminder that even in the most refined circles, the choice between truth and convenience remained as urgent as ever. The gallery would be remembered not merely as the scene of sophisticated murder, but as testament to the power of individual integrity to expose and ultimately defeat systematic deception. Lady Vale's ghost would linger here, not as supernatural presence, but as inspiration for all who faced similar choices between principle and expediency. The case was closed, justice served, yet the deeper mysteries of human nature remained as complex and fascinating as ever. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by empty spaces where beauty had once resided, Alleyn carried with him the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed and the sobering awareness that such revelations always carried costs extending far beyond their immediate circumstances.